All right, welcome everyone who's joining. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to wait maybe a minute or so to let a couple more people trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, great. I think we'll get started now. So thanks again for everyone who came to this talk today. This is our second to last talk in the Bench2Market series. Today's talk will be about go-to-market strategy and milestone creation for new startups. As a reminder, this talk series is co-sponsored by Biolocity, the Georgia Clinical and Translational Science Alliance, and the Petit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience. I'm John Nikosha, the Associate Director of Biolocity, and I'm stepping in for our Managing Director, Dr. Courtney Law. I also want to put in a quick plug for the next and final webinar in our Bench2Market series for this year. This one's going to be about financing and dilution for startup companies, and it's going to be presented by Dr. James Stubbs. So this should be a great talk, and we've got our link to register for this talk at the bottom of this slide, and you can also find it on our website. I also wanted to mention that we've got a new Bench2Market series coming this fall. So coming soon, we'll be sending out a survey to see how everyone enjoyed this year's series and solicit some recommendations and feedback for new events that we can, and new topics that we can cover in this series. So keep an eye out for that as well. I also wanted to put in a quick reminder here that Biolocity has a partnership with the Emory School of Law and Professor Nicole Morris for legal office hours. So you can sign up for this on our website. You can see the link at the bottom of the slide here. But if you have questions about really anything IP related, patent prior art searches, patent applications, ownership, inventorship, any of that kind of stuff, feel free to sign up for an appointment on our website here. And then additionally, Biolocity is a member of the Bara Drive Accelerator network, and this allows us to expand our reach kind of beyond just Georgia Tech and Emory. So Bara is currently soliciting applications for their BAA areas of interest. You can see the 5 of them that are currently running listed here. ENACT for early notification to act, control, and treat infectious diseases. One for solving sepsis, another for repurposed drugs, another for needle-free routes of administration for vaccines, and then finally our most recent one for immune chip, which is advanced microphysiological immune tissue platforms. So if you or anyone you know is working on projects in these spaces, please contact the Biolocity team, and we'd be happy to assist with any questions about getting in touch with BARDA. Additionally, as part of our partnership with BARDA, we are running this Mask Innovation Challenge. The open call for Mask Innovation Challenge applications has closed, but we are hosting a regional event for the top 10 teams in our region on May 25th at 12 p.m. And so feel free to sign up and register for this event as well. It should be a pretty interesting, interesting event going over some innovation in mask design. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Brian Walsh is a global technology and medical industry executive with 30 years of experience in general management, operations, and marketing. He's got a strong focus on implementation and execution, and has worked on a variety of projects, including cardiology, urology, surgery, aesthetics, and oncology indications. He's got a proven ability to conceptualize and manage complex solutions to address various business, customer, and product development needs. Beyond that, Brian's also one of our experts in residence here on the Biolocity team and is overall a pretty great guy. So I'll turn it over to Brian now to give the talk for today.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to share screen. Hopefully that's work. Is that okay? Yes.
Looks good. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So welcome everybody, and congratulations if you're part of the Biolocity applicants that have made it to this stage. This means you've started your journey, and one of the next things we're going to ask you to do is set up some plans and some milestones that would be attractive both to strategic acquirers as well as to funders. Real quick on my background, so my experience has been in large companies like Siemens, where I was responsible for nuclear medicine imaging for the world when I first came out of college. And then I did a stint in Silicon Valley, which was another education. Then I ran North America and South America for a company called Bench2, which gave me a lot of experience in thinking about how to bring products to market independent of the technology or the market segment. So I'm going to try to lead you, start with real basic concepts, and then build it into what you need to put together in terms of your presentation to get acquired or funded, etc. So that said, I think my slides work. Here we go. Okay, so overall, I'm going to touch on how you plan and what a plan is. Understanding academic aims versus industry milestones. These are two very, very different worlds. And many of you are kind of in the academic space and you know, are very strong in that place, but it's a very different way of thinking about the world. And then I'd like to talk about value inflection points and killer experiments, which aren't quite as ominous as they might sound. So I'm going to do a basic planning example in the spirit of the spring rather. I'll give my really basic Green Acres example. So let's say we were going to plan how to build a garden. You're going to have a task, some owners, a start date and end date. You go through a series of things. This looks pretty simple and pretty logical, and it's the foundation of pretty much building up all of your implementation plans. And I can tell you, after my years in Silicon Valley, this was the foundation of implementation, and it became the mantra you lived by. So the definitional plan is a task, a date, and an owner, and then you build it out with more cost and dependencies, right? So very, very basic example. So if you take this and take it into something more like this is a Gantt chart. Gantt charts are visual assessments of your plan. So you can see the bold here is a major topic, and then it has subtopics underneath that. And a couple other things that this enables you to do is you can see dependencies and critical path. So you can tell where you are. Usually it's a vertical line on whatever the date is, and say, here's where I am. Here's all the things that are running in parallel, kind of here's what's going on. If you get used to looking at these, a couple of the things that you'll start to see is as you develop these plans into the future, when you have multiple things happening in parallel, which is pretty easy to visualize because you'll see more and more blue lines and black lines overlap, you start to get to the place where you say, I have too many lines. I have more lines than people or more lines than resources. Then you know you have to redo your plan because it probably doesn't make sense. So, you know, the major parts of this, it gives you some sort of normalization timetable. It gives you a visual assessment of where you are, and you can identify dependencies, which are super important because you know if you have a dependency, you can't start your next piece until you finish your dependent piece, right? And you can find critical path. At the same time, it lays out all the resources that you either have or need and allows you to avoid missing items. So it's pretty important. And this is what is normally used in industry. It's also normally what investors want to see is something like this. This is pretty standard. There's different forms of it. But in general, this is how they lay out in terms of pure development. If we talk about academic emphasis and research aims, the academic world's a little different than the research world. I'm sorry, than the commercial world, in that academically you tend to maximize your understanding of something, right? And you emphasize the creation of new knowledge and try to characterize it pretty completely, right? How does it work? Why does it work? What are all the mechanisms? What are all the options that we might think about, and then you build a consensus within your team. And then ultimately it's documented, but the form of documentation often is, other than lab notes, it may be a published paper at the very end where you say, okay, here is the result, which is almost exactly the opposite of what you would do in the commercial world. In industry, there's a lot of go, no-go decision making. And the focus most of the time is to minimize time to market. So to do that, you don't need to know everything about the problem. You don't need to know every potential solution. You may need to know maybe a couple and choose your best. But the whole point is to execute quickly, and you need to be very efficient with capital. That means you need to be fast and not just spending money. You're trying to mitigate risks in technology, regulatory, and market. And what's really important on this is that you document what you're going to do before you start. So the normal development process involves developing user needs. And from user needs, then design specifications are created. And then from design specifications, you actually can build something. And then you perform verification work. And that verification work is also documented. That is actually the tests against your design. And then you do validation, which is test of your user needs. Did you satisfy what you were trying to do? But all this is documented on the front side. And this oftentimes goes into what's known as a quality system. And there's formal templates. And this is in regulated spaces, these are prescribed by entities like the US FDA. So there isn't a lot of wiggle room on this. And when you get audited, they expect to see documents like this. Or when you submit depending on the class of product, they would expect to see documents that fit into those specific spaces. It's very, very prescriptive. So where to start? Let's start with a basic idea. And these are the fundamental questions that are going to come up whether you're talking to strategics or investors, okay? So this somehow, what you want to do is work these into your master plan. So, okay, what's your technology? That's pretty basic, I think, and people have an idea about their solution. But the intellectual property, if you don't have intellectual property, it really becomes a challenge to move forward, because whatever you're building can be copied. And even if you're faster, ultimately it will be argued to your frustration, it's going to catch you. So IP ends up being super, super important. Indications and claims, these are what you're going to claim to regulating agencies. So if you say you're going to diminish pain, if you're going to cure cancer, if you're going to reduce the reduction of regurgitant blood flow through heart valves, these are essentially the things that you have to prove. And the more aggressive you make these, the more you have to prove, and potentially the bigger the study you have to do to support it. So this is really, really important, and regulatory resources spend a lot of time thinking about strategies as how to cast your indications and claims for regulating agencies. And then obviously the other important part of this is who will pay. So there are multiple options here, right? So you have two types of government. You have Medicare. So if you have indications that are for the 65 and older crowd, that would be Medicare, which is federally funded. If it's underprivileged, there's state level funding for Medicaid. And then the largest carriers are private insurance in the US. And then in some cases, the patient self-pays, right? Like in the case of aesthetics, if you need your Botox or whatever, you probably aren't going to get an insurance company pay for that because really it's a necessity. But a patient would potentially to look and feel better. And then one of the fundamental questions, and I know some of the technologies in the program aren't regulated, but if it is regulated, as I mentioned, it's a highly prescriptive process that you go through. If it isn't regulated, the process is still pretty much the same because that's what investors and strategics expect to see. They still expect to see plans that are laid out professionally with major milestones, value inflection points, etc. It's just that the entity that's going to regulate you may or may not actually regulate you, right? So again, regulated products have a very prescriptive approach. So in devices and software, they're classified into class 1, 2, and 3, and that's defined by safety and efficacy. So bedpans would, for instance, might be a class 1. An implantable heart valve would be a class 3, so because it's the highest risk. The other things to consider are if it's devices, are there similar products or predicate devices? If there are, it makes your pathway easier to move forward. And are there applicable FDA guidances and ISO standards? That also makes your pathway more straightforward because you know what's required. There likely will be some bench testing, and there may be phantoms that are required as well. In the drug and biologic world, you try to look at, are the processes used by similar agents, and are there well accepted small and large animal models? So what this accepted model means is, what you don't want to do with the FDA is be novel. You would like to have, if you're going to have some product that has to have small animal or large animal testing, you want to see who's done something similar with a similar type of animal before, because otherwise you have to prove your model before you actually prove your own science, which is a problem. And then the areas that go into the master plans that are sources of risk are formulation, scale. A lot of times we see scale as a challenge where in the lab you can make 1 milligram of something, but can you make that work at a different level? You need to make a metric ton of this stuff. How is that going to work? And then evidence for safety and efficacy it falls into that plan as well. And I'll give you an example of what some of those look like. Okay, so this is a really important chart. And I have to give credit to Shauna Corey, who used to be with this program. I'm not sure she got it, but it's really important in understanding value inflection points. So there's 3 curves, as you can see. One's risk, one's cost, and one's value. And you can see the risk is a smooth curve. It's very high at the beginning because that's your highest risk. And then as you do more and more things, you de-risk your project, right? And at the end, you would have a very low risk project. But at the same time, at the beginning, you've spent no money, and your spend seems to increase rapidly as you move towards the right-hand side of the graph. But what's important here, those are important, but what starts to become really important here is the value chart. And you'll notice it's a step function. So if you are developing a product and you are between 2 steps and you never get to the next step, those steps are known as value inflection points. You get credit for knowing something, or doing something, but it doesn't really reach the value inflection point. It's really hard to say you've created value for your project if you only got halfway there, even though you may have spent a lot of money, spent a lot of time. So you really need to get to those value inflection points. And I'll give you a couple of examples here in a second. But many of those are, those are the things that the outside world measures you against. And you don't get credit for working hard or trying hard or any of the other stuff, really. It's for the achievement of these value inflection points. So I'm going to give you the pathway for a class 2 medical device. Really, this is really typical high-level stuff. You'll start with a functional proof of concept, and you'll build product and iterate product. So say in software, you might go through multiple iterations until it becomes stable and it has the user characteristics you need. And at some point, you freeze the design. And what that means is you can't change it anymore. It's frozen. And the next step is verification testing. So in verification testing, you actually verify the product works the way the specification dictates. And normally in this, you'll find defects and bugs and issues, etc. And so then you go back to the engineering group and they make changes, and then you freeze the design again, and then you start retesting again. In this cycle, you really want to be pretty stable here, or this cycle could be quite long and expensive. Once the verification is complete, you'll typically do some sort of validation work, whether it's with phantoms or whether it could be with patients with an imaging product, for example, or something like that. And that tends to be more like the clinical evidence that you're going to supply to the FDA if it's required. It isn't always required. After that, you'd actually submit to the FDA under something called a 510K. And they have 90 days to review your application, but typically near the end of that 90 days, they're going to ask you some questions and reset your clock. And it usually takes 5 to 6 months to get through a 510K clearance. And then at that point, when you're cleared, you're allowed to market your product. So you register your product with the FDA and you can sell it your first customers. But that's kind of the general framework. Class 1 products, you actually don't have to necessarily submit documents to the FDA. You may be inspected, and you still have to go through the same process. But you don't necessarily have to submit it to the FDA. And for class 3, the validation and verification piece is much larger. So you can imagine for implantable products, you're going to do biocompatibility, you're going to do toxicity, you're going to do accelerated life, you're going to do a bunch of compatibility with various tissues, etc. So these verification and validation cycles can be larger and more expensive, in fact, than the design work that goes into it. So here's what a development plan might look like if you were presenting. This is from a deck that was probably used to present for funding to venture folks, right? So it has a date. Across the top, it has value inflection points. So design lock, the fact that you got to a design lock is a value inflection point. The fact you got your FDA clearance is a value inflection point. CE mark is what you do if you get approved in Europe. And then cash flow positive would be another value inflection point. And usually the way the conversation goes is I need this amount of money to get to this milestone. And that's what investors are expecting you to say. And there's certain activities and certain milestones that that strategics look at more heavily. So most strategics are looking ultimately to build revenue. And in those cases, they're going to look for a later stage. So they want you to be farther right in this process. So you can see the phases here in the various phases in funding, the first phase, second phase, and third phase, and the various work that goes with it. But this is the general framework. And for those of you that are working with Biolocity, this is the framework that you're going to create something. It may look different than this. There are many ways to present this, but this is what the general framework looks like for these presentations. For a therapeutic, so these are drugs. So a little bit different pathway, super prescriptive, longer time to market, more steps, right? So you're gonna have some early proof of concept, and at some point, you're gonna have to identify a lead candidate. So you may have, 30 candidates, but you're ultimately gonna pick what's known as your lead. And then you're gonna go through this investigational new drug application and phase 1 trials, phase 2, and phase 3. So phase 1, safety. Phase 2 is efficacy. Phase 3 is usually dosing. And then you ultimately ask for a new drug application. And in these cases, this is very expensive in multiple years because the trials tend to be very large. And so I'll give you an idea of kind of what that looks like, I think, for drug development. So if you look across the bottom, it says universities, biotech startup, and then large pharmaceutical companies. The reality is it's super difficult for you to go all the way to the end and actually market the drug. It's just so expensive. So universities usually have kind of proof of concept. They might have some number of leads, maybe multiple leads, in a preclinical sense. And then you start, and usually that then goes into some sort of startup biotech or other small biotech company. And more work is done, and a lot of preclinical work and limited clinical work. So you might start some of that phase 1 and phase 2 development, but for sure by the time you're going to get to the large clinical trials with the large human populations, where you might have 1,000 or thousands of patients, that's super, super expensive. So that ends up more likely transitioning to the large pharmaceutical company. So as you go through this process, you need to garner funding and garner interest, right? And so hopefully by the time you get to the place where the biotech startup is kind of finished its work and really can't move forward, that you have enough interest from a strategic partner that is willing to acquire that technology and move it forward. So this is what a pharma development might look like. So you can see in the upper left, it has formalization, optimization, and lead molecules, right? And then there's some pharmacokinetics and toxicology and a bunch of other testing you have to do. This is pretty involved stuff, and it takes a lot of time. And where it says CRO, those are clinical research organizations. So some of the stuff can be done inside the university, some not. And then you have these contract manufacturers as well that help develop things. So you need partners in the outside world. So, but this gives you an idea of kind of all of the activities. And when you explode this out to a super high level of detail, there could be hundreds of lines here. And you just have to sort out which of those do you need partners for, what the cost is going to be, and then where do I, which of those do we take on, which of those do we not take on in the development process. So in terms of value inflection points, these are kind of things that you might consider as you think about your projects and as you develop your decks, if you will. Status of your IP, when it's issued, completion of certain work could be a major value inflection point. Whether you got your proof of concept, design freeze, completed some form of testing, whatever that might be, it depends on the technology. Whether you got to a first in man, which means I put, usually it's a low quantity, 1 to 5, whatever in a human. That's a pretty big value inflection point, provided it's successful. And it usually kind of garners the next round of major funding. Whether your 510K is cleared or filed, or whether your PMA is approved or filed, or your IDE or IND, all of these things are very significant value inflection points, and they'll tie to your funding cycles and your focus. So the killer experiment. It feels a little bit contradictory, but this really, the idea here is you want your project to end, right? So you kind of look at where are we today and what level of proof is required to go forward, and what are the dependent tasks and critical path items. So what do I have to do next? And if it doesn't succeed, my project dies, because what you're trying to balance is this going to work? Or if it's not going to work, I want to know really, really soon so I can move on to something else and not waste my time. That's what you're balancing here. So you look at what are the experiments that have high value to FDA, funder, acquirers, and customers. And so some of the funders, when you meet with them, are going to say, this is all great, but I would like to see this. Or an acquirer may say something similar. This is really good, but I can't acquire until I know that it's whatever. So those are the experiments that you want to do, and they may succeed, and now you have the evidence to move forward and get funded or acquired or whatever, or not. And if it's not, then you kind of pull the plug and say, I learned something from the experience, but I need to move on to something else because this isn't going to make it. So a killer experiment, here's a couple examples. So if you're building a transcatheter delivered heart valve and the working channel in the largest possible catheter is 16 French, your heart valve has to fit inside that, fold up and fit inside that catheter, right? So to do that, you're probably going to have to build something that proves that your design of a heart valve can be delivered in a 16 French catheter. You're probably going to have to deliver it in pigs and cadavers and create evidence for this. If you can't make it work, then we have a problem, right? In another case, we had a project once that involved developing a new low-cost ceramic material to replace the crystals used in X-ray equipment. And this was a very cool technology, but the killer experiment for this was there are standard American College of Radiology panels which measure resolution and contrast, etc. Their killer experiment was actually to image those devices and see if they can match or improve upon that performance. And the phantom you see is on the right. And in this case, that didn't work out. The technology was very cool and it was really neat, but it didn't meet the killer experiment, and that was the design and the desired outcome. And so that PI went on to do other things once they realized they couldn't outperform the current technology. So again, you've seen this as a basic Gantt chart, and we're trying to take this and turn it into something more like this, right? So again, these are general framework of what you're going to be creating going forward with various value inflection points, milestones, and funding phases. And the amount you fund here, this is a pretty low cost project. If this was in therapeutics, pharma, these are going to be millions probably. Most class 2 devices are going to be hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars type thing. So it's just going to be based on your technology, your indication, your pathway, and what you choose as your first target. So this is kind of the challenge now. Going forward, determine what you need to do, identify what those resources are and where they are, who can do it. With their help, you can estimate the amount of time and figure out where the dependencies are, right? And there's also a cost factor because you need that to sort out how much do I need to move forward and build out my project. So questions? That was kind of a general idea at a very simple level. And we'll obviously help you through these as we work with you. But other questions?
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. And we had a couple questions come in before the webinar, and then a few as well that came in while you were talking. So I guess I'll start off with some of the ones that were sent in. Is it helpful to clarify milestones based on the different stages of your company? Like, would it be helpful to group it by pre-seed versus Series A milestones?
Yeah, so it ends up, if you look at something like this, or some of the other charts, if you're pre-seed, that kind of implies you have a low amount of money. At that point, you're generally doing things like proof of concept. You got to some sort of achieved your proof of concept. You're not going to have the money typically in a pre-seed to get to design lock, which is a kind of more advanced milestone. So usually in pre-seed, you're doing mainly proof of concept type things. If you're getting your Series A, or if you're doing a seed, you might get to design lock depending on your technology and what you have to do to get there. But as you get to the, getting to say, class 2 device, you're going to probably need seed funding to get through all the verification and validation work based on, depending on how much you have to do and get through your regulatory filings. So there is a relationship between the cost and the complexity of those and the seed you're in. Because as you move, from pre-seed to seed to Series A, Series B, the amounts of funding go up, right? And they can go up quite a lot. But that allows you to accomplish a lot more, if that makes sense.
Thanks, yeah, that's helpful. Another question that came in is it best to try to market your product to specific thought leaders or clinicians in the field before you go about kind of a general marketing or business strategy? So
in order to get funded or have anyone consider you for acquisition, and I'm going to separate this a little bit. You really need to have a business model of some sort. You have to know whether you're going to sell it, or is it software as a service, is it consumable, is it capital equipment? How is someone going to actually benefit economically from whatever you're offering as a solution? So that needs to be done on the front side. The way I think of, so in terms of marketing, marketing has to do with branding, awareness, and how you do what you do. The way I always thought about it, like when I worked on big workstations, I didn't necessarily market to KOLs, key opinion leaders at the onset. I would usually want them to use the product because that provided a reference site, it provided feedback, enabled me to build, make products better. So they weren't necessarily the first I marketed to. I did approach them. And in the US, it's such a big country, usually you do that in a geographically diverse way. So you pick certain key states like Florida, California, Illinois, New York, Texas. And only because, depending on what you're doing in the procedure, somebody may have to travel to see them do something with your product, etc. And they typically don't want to fly across the US. But I view KOLs as often providing a lot of feedback and capabilities that I didn't necessarily market to them on the front side. They kind of fit in a different role in the way I thought about it. But I do want to separate that from the business plan, because you should have a business plan from the get-go. You may have to refine it, you may have to pivot, but when you lay out what's in front, what you see on the slide here, you should have a way that someone can benefit economically. If you don't, and you're just building a cool product, that can be kind of a death knell, because if you can't, even if it's very cool and people really want it, if no one will pay for it, and no one can benefit economically, it is probably more likely to die than not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we got a couple other questions kind of on this topic as well. So maybe digging a little deeper into this, like what are some examples of what this could look like for a specific company? How do you kind of pressure test these ideas with potential customers or other market considerations?
Pressure test the development piece. I'm sorry.
I think so. Yeah, I think the questioner was asking about how would you sort of test out this while you're developing a product, basically.
Oh, I see. That's usually depending on your technology. Usually it's a pretty iterative process, at least on the device side, right? If you want to get something in front of somebody, you can explain it, but usually you have to have kind of a major point is something that's conceptual. It's something that looks like, acts like, sort of that thing, so people can get some sense of what it looks like. And you may need to iterate multiple times. Usually there's cycles that you go through. And the thing to remember from medical products is the people that pay for it or even choose it may not be the people who use it, right? So a purchasing agent in a hospital may be buying something that a nurse uses as a product. So you have to kind of look at stakeholders and figure out what their interests are by stakeholder type. And usually there's some level of iteration though that goes with that process. Coming up on, in this case here, it shows design lock. Before we reach design lock, I would warn the following as well. There's a temptation a lot of times to build too much. And what you're really hunting for here is the minimally viable product, the MVP, right? So you really want to focus on the things that add value and are part of your core technology or your core solution. I'll give you an example. I was working with one startup that built workstations, and they were medical imaging workstations for CT, and they had some very special computational fluid dynamic software for making special measurements, and that was their core technology. And so they went to build out the workstation, and what we focused on was not trying to build a better workstation. We know that GE had them, and Siemens had them, and Philips had them, and Recon, and all those other companies had workstations. And the kind of way a workstation works and interacts is pretty consistent between vendors, so they would argue they're differentiated. And so what you really didn't want to do is innovate, because you wanted something that was intuitive and fit with their workflow and fit with what they do and liked already, and focus on your key technology, which was the CFD piece of this. And so I would encourage you to focus heavily on your piece of innovation, and not necessarily, even though you may say, I could make it really slick, whatever, that may not be core to what you're doing, and it may or may not matter. And as soon as you start this race, you're definitely under a time pressure. So focus on MVP. That'd be my recommendation.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. And then I guess one more question about customer discovery. Are there existing services that you could use to kind of accomplish these customer discovery kind of questions, or should people really kind of be planning on doing that themselves?
So for customer discovery, of course, there are entities you can pay. They tend to be expensive. So that said, if you're doing a startup and you have an early stage technology, I would encourage you that this is one of the things you want to be good at and be close to, because it is your product, right? And you really want to, you don't want someone handing you a report and saying, okay, build it like this. So there are multiple different entities that can help you gather those skills and capabilities. And we help you through some of that process as well through the Velocity program. But it is, I would encourage you to try to, at least at some level, become competent in this space, because it's very difficult. These products, oftentimes, especially in early startups, pivot and pivot again. And it's hard to know what your options are for the pivot, unless you're a part of that whole feedback and input process, as opposed to someone handing it to you and saying, yeah, go build this and let's hope. Most startups usually don't have the money either to outsource it, but if you did, I would encourage you to try to do it yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I also want to circle back. You made a comment about your minimum viable product, and we had a question come in that was basically from the standpoint of fundraising, how do you think about accurately defining your killer experiment and avoiding a constant escalating, great, but I want to see X? If you're shopping this around to investors, and where do you kind of draw that line?
So, yeah, this is a really good question, because this is where you can get cycled a lot. Usually before you reach kind of the investor piece of this, there's a killer experiment you have to undertake just to make sure you can get to something. Usually it's technical in nature. You have to just prove it works or something, right? But the part that becomes challenging is when you talk to a strategic or a funder and they say, wow, this is really cool, but we'd love to see this. And in those conversations, I typically push back and say, okay, so we understand you'd like to see this, this, and this. If we are to do, are you willing to fund? They're pretty straightforward in saying yes or no about, or signing up kind of on, it's not a strong commitment, but kind of committing to that, to funding and moving it forward if you show that evidence. The problem will be in a lot of conversations, people may or may not know. You'll be much better educated in the space than they are. So what they ask you for may or may not be a reasonable request. And so you have a task of trying to compel them differently. But the other piece of that is trying to establish some sort of commitment that goes with it. Because it's true, you can end up doing one thing and then the next thing, and who knows? And so it's always going to be your decision. But if you start to hear the same thing from more than one, then that may be an indication that you need to at least get some evidence that puts that issue, whatever it is, aside, whether that's you have to do an experiment or a test or whatever you have to do to prove it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, especially about kind of flipping it and saying, okay, well, if I do X, will you commit to, to some kind of funding? I think that's really helpful. We had a couple questions come in relating to software technology specifically. So I guess to begin with, one of the, Nikki asked, most software is not patented from what I know. Does this still present an issue with investors from an IP perspective?
So it can be patented depending on what you're doing. And then there's copyright is the other protection. So the way you write your code, it can be copyrighted, but that's a form of protection. I think you'd want to have at least that, which isn't particularly challenging to get copyright. And then there's the other form of what you do, something called trade secret, right? Which is, you may have a patent around something and you have copyright around your software, but there's a bunch of other know-how that goes into how you built it. And unless you happen to know all that stuff, even with the patent, you really can't build the product. And so that usually ends up staying inside the company as part of what you know and how you do what you do. And it also is a source of value. It's hard to say it's a value inflection point, but it is something that will become kind of part of your organization. So when someone acquires you, they'll want that know-how. And that will be part of kind of what your value is that other know-how besides the intellectual property itself. But usually you see patent and copyright super, super common in software.
Got it. Thanks. And another question about software. This person asks, when it comes to software, it's the first to product market that may be crucial to the success. Having a minimally viable product is essential, but are there any other factors to consider, especially if you do have copyrighted software rather than patented software?
So, yeah, I think what you're asking about was first mover advantage, which is the first one to market in a particular space, which can be an advantage for sure. So generally, you're faster if your MVP is more concise and you know exactly what you want to build. Software is an interesting thing because there's, unlike if we're building a new stent or something like that, you kind of know when you build version 1.0 that there will be a 1.1. There's never just a 1.0, right? So you know what's coming. And so usually you have successive development cycles that are running concurrently, right, over time. When you first start, that isn't the case, right? But once you kind of get out there, but I would encourage you, especially in the first 1 or 2 cycles, you need to be able to really support whatever's happening in the field. And if it's a regulated product, your verification and validation cycles get longer than if it's an unregulated product. And I don't know in this case, but what you really want to do is make sure you support heavily early on until you get very stable. Because the problem with software, a lot of times customers will use it or break it in ways you didn't anticipate. But yeah, I would say it's better to be concise and fast. So be very focused than to be broad and layer in those feature sets kind of over time and build on it, because it'll give you at the same time chance to resolve defects and other issues on the main product. So normally what you see in organizations that build a lot of software professionally is early launch and then quick releases, might be quarterly. You come up with a new release, a new update, and then over time they slow down because you kind of beat down the flames that are coming out through the cracks. If that makes sense.
Great. Yeah, thanks. That's really great advice. And then a couple other questions are a little more, I guess, pragmatic. The first one from Eric asks, is the framework you describe useful to show in commercialization plans for phase 2 SBIR applications?
I have never written an SBIR. I've worked in industry for 35 years. So I suppose it would be, but there may be someone better qualified than me to answer SBIRs. I apologize. I could take a shot at it, but it's not a well-qualified answer. So you might want to hold that and we'll see if we can find somebody else who's better qualified to answer it.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm not a great SBIR point person either. And then finally, this is specifically to Biolocity. Brian, in your experience working with Biolocity and Coulter teams, what level of milestones that you showed here would be reasonably expected that you could achieve with Biolocity funding?
Well, it depends on where you start. It depends what your technology is. It depends how much money you need, right? And it kind of depends on what your, it depends, right? So that all said, we have seen devices where people have gone through multiple iterations to get to proof of concept. We've seen them get design lock. We've seen them go from design lock all the way through verification, validation, up to FDA filing on devices. On therapeutics, we've seen them go from a broad spectrum to a lead candidate. And through a lot of the early stage testing, a lot of times on the therapeutics, there tends to be questions depending on your technology related to like scale up and stuff like that. And so you kind of want to you need to get to at least evidence that you can scale before you can get next investment. So you kind of get halfway there sort of on the therapeutic side. A class 1, class 2, you can get all the way up to an FDA clearance. I don't know that we've ever gone through a clearance. I remember that. And for a class 3 device, we've gone through proof of concept, small animal work, large animal work, cadaver work. So pretty far along in terms of bench and verification and some validation. Not full-blown clinical trials. Full-blown clinical trial for class 3 device tends to be pretty expensive and beyond the scope of the Biolocity.
Great.
And it sort of depends on where you are and what you're doing.
Right, for sure. Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And my limited experience, it certainly varies quite a bit, but the whole goal of our funding is to reach some kind of a value inflection point. So very helpful to think in terms of milestones and value creation throughout this whole process. Yes, I think that's all of our questions that I can see at this point. If we don't have any others, I'd like to thank our speaker, Brian, again, for a great overview of milestones and value creation in these kinds of projects. And thank you to all of our registrants for attending the talk today. Please come back, as we said, for our last talk in the series. And yeah, we look forward to chatting with all of you. Thanks.
Sure.